Chapter 39 of The 13th Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by RebeccaTruestone. The 13th Man by Mrs. Coulson Kernahan. A Supernatural Happening. I could not help listening, the woman half apologized with a good-humored smile. You see, I am so dead nuts on things psychic, and I can tell you, gentlemen, a remarkable story which may interest you, and which my husband, who is just now enjoying a cocktail, can vouch for. That gentleman, indicating Philip with a fat, white hand sparkling with jewels, thinks he saw his dead sweetheart looking out of another woman's eyes. Now that was a very tall story, or would be to some people's thinking, because the second lady must be supposed to have a spirit of her own to accommodate in her body already. But I can very well believe it. With your permission, I will bring my cup to your table. Fortunately, everyone has left us now, and we can be just comfortable. The two men made a place for the extraordinary woman, who sat down at once in the chair Philip offered her. At first, both Philip and Brown had been disposed to take offense, but the woman's daring won the day. Now in Chicago, where we hail from, there is a family as proud as Lucifer, because the woman's grandmother was an English aristocrat. This grandmother used to do most wonderful tapestry. She spent all her time that way. When she was dying, she was all the time worrying about a piece she had not finished, and her last words were, "I will finish it." She waited for effect. Well, now I'll go on to the conclusion. The granddaughter of this strong-willed old aristocrat was a very stupid girl, and all their dollars could make nothing of her. But she was to take a top seat all the same. That girl, who could not sew on a button, took and finished the fine tapestry her grandmother had begun, and the work was perfect. All the family, even the cook and the boot boy, came to have a look at her working. They peeped through a nick in the door, and when the work was done, the girl said she had not done it and had never seen it, and if she had done it, it must have been in her sleep. And from the day the tapestry was finished, she never touched a needle. What do you gentlemen think of that? Of course the grandmother had used the girl's fingers and finished the work, as she had vowed to do when she was dying. The narrator of this story was a little disappointed in its reception, for both Philip and Brown seemed to find it funny merrily. They laughed a good deal. That was a case of the ruling passion strong after death, wasn't it? Asked Philip. There's no such thing as death, affirmed the lady with some warmth. There's something pretty disagreeable called by that name, nevertheless, commented Brown. I guess when I am what they call dead, I shall know a heap more than those who are putting wreaths on me, she declared. But there is my husband, and we are going out, so I wish you both good-bye. What a curious specimen, said Philip, as the silk skirts disappeared through the door. You had better look out, or she will hang on to you as you are staying here. She would, I'm sure, laughed Brown. But I go back to London tomorrow morning. I go back to Hastings tomorrow, too, answered Philip. Well, we will enjoy tonight together, at any rate, Brown concluded. It had been a good thing for Philip that he had met Brown that night. Depression had been playing up with him more than he knew. He was at a loss to understand why he had felt so wretchedly blue since Phyllis had gone. It was certainly not the loss of that erratic young woman that had caused it. It was certainly not the loss of the manuscript, for he had come to dislike the book heartily since Miss Le Breton had not liked it. The strained relations at Hawk's Nest were no new thing. Philip was at a loose end, and his one desire was to open his heart to Dan's Madonna. But would it be fair to Dan? After all, there was nothing definite between Dan and his Madonna as yet. There could be no harm in going to the White House and getting a little comfort for himself. He had quite forgotten his idea of making a marriage which should help his career. The man had done this in his story. He now heartily despised that man who was so unpleasantly like himself. Possibly the self-knowledge that had mysteriously come to him had something to do with his depression. One thing he decided during the train journey home. He would make himself agreeable when he got there. If he did not do that, he could not face Miss Le Breton. This was curious, as she could know nothing about it. But somehow he felt that he must improve himself if he were to come into that girl's presence. That girl, Dan's Madonna, and Dan was invited to stay there. Dan was going. Happy Dan. Philip began to pity himself as that most unhappy of things, the man who must stand aside and look upon another man's joy. Philip liked Dan, genuinely liked him. Dan had always been a reliable friend. He had put up with moroseness and ill humor. He had shown ill-deserved affection towards a man few liked and many disliked. Good old Dan. But Philip envied him all the same. Philip was destined to see more of Amy Le Breton than he had hoped for. Mrs. Barrimore had said to Uncle Robert, after the kindness Alvin and Mrs. Le Breton had shown to her boy, "I ought to call on them, Robert," and he had thoroughly agreed. So while Philip had been at Brighton, Mrs. Barrimore and Mr. Burns had driven over to Gissing and made a formal call at the White House, and had come back nearly as much in love with Amy Le Breton as Dan was. "If Euretta were like Miss Le Breton, as we hear she was," Mrs. Barrymore had said to her brother on the way home, "I no longer wonder that Philip was so much in love. She is adorable." In which sentiment Uncle Robert had agreed. He even went so far as to say she had inspired a lyric which he would write down when he got home. Neither Mrs. Barrymore nor Uncle Robert had seen Euretta during that visit to London with her father when Philip had fallen in love and become engaged, of course without consulting them. Now, having seen what Euretta had been like, both the mother and the uncle entirely exonerated Philip for the sudden engagement, for which at the time they had mildly blamed him. "I should have done it myself at Philip's age," Uncle Robert had confessed. He furthermore had expressed the opinion that it was quite impossible that Miss Le Breton's mind had ever been clouded. She was not even neurotic. There had been some big mistake or some big deception. Mrs. Barrymore had arrived at precisely the same opinion. Things had developed so far during Philip's stay in Brighton that when he arrived at Hawksnest he found the White House folk lunching there. He did not enter the dining room until he had made an unusually careful toilet. This was a new departure for Philip, who had been rather careless of his personal appearance during the last months. He tried on 3 ties from his bag before he was satisfied with one. He arranged his hair carefully, noting the while that it wanted cutting and regretting that he had not seen to it. He shaved, although he had already shaved that day, and scrutinized his features in the glass, wondering if he looked his best clean-shaven. He decided that he did. His mouth was good, and he needed not to hide it by a mustache. His chin was strong. Yes, it was by no means a bad-looking face that he saw reflected in the glass. He was glad that Colonel Lane was not of the party. He had ascertained that fact from the parlour-maid. She had told him that Colonel Lane had gone back to Dulwich, as his friend Colonel Henderson had had a relapse. When quite satisfied with his appearance, Philip went down to the dining-room, where the tender mother was, of course, the first to welcome her boy. Her loving arms were about him the moment he entered the room. Her heart harbored no resentment for his cold and even cruel behavior when he had parted with her. He did not forget, however, and a flush of genuine shame came to his face as he remembered his words to her, "Women never know when a man wants to be left alone." He had now quite enough of being alone. Never for months had he greeted his mother so affectionately, and to his credit be it recorded that it was not done because the eyes of the woman with whom he wanted to stand well were upon him. When the mother, radiant and with one of those lovely blushes on her cheek, had gone back to her seat, when Mrs. Le Breton, Mr. Alvin, and Amy had been duly greeted, and Uncle Robert had made Philip's hand tingle by a hearty grip, Philip took his place with the rest. "It is good to be home," he said. "East or west, home's best," quoted Uncle Robert. "And what is home without a mother?" said Philip, with an affectionate glance in Mrs. Barrymore's direction. "Who is quoting now?" cried Uncle Robert, beaming. "Do you know, Mrs. Le Breton," he went on, "my quotations drove that young man from home. He couldn't stand them. They got on his nerves." "I think I got on everyone's nerves," said Philip. "I begin to see that I am an intolerant beast." Uncle Robert stared. What had come over Philip? The Brighton air seemed to have performed miracles. Euretta dropped her table napkin and stooped to pick it up, but it was not the stooping that flushed her pale cheek. She did not once look at Philip till the meal was ended. But Philip looked at her more than once. She was wearing a black felt hat, wide in the brim, on which was a wonderful white ostrich feather. Philip decided that black and white was by far the most becoming combination. Uoretta, he remembered, had dressed less quietly, though in perfect good taste. The guests left soon after luncheon, and Alvin offered to give Philip a lift home. But Philip, thanking him, said he wanted to stay a day or two with his mother. It was then that Philip once more saw Uoretta looking out of the eyes of Miss Le Breton. Again, the sudden impulse to take the girl to his heart had to be suppressed. The impulse this time was so strong that Philip wondered afterwards that he had been able to resist it, even though others were by. End of chapter 39.
Chapter 40 of The 13th Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The 13th Man by Mrs. Coulson Kernahan. Mother and Son. Philip stayed for a whole week at Hawk's Nest. Davis had brought soda over, and Philip had ridden over once or twice to look at the bungalow. It had been an ideal week to Mrs. Barrimore, for Philip had shown her so much affection. Philip had always had a deep love for his mother, even when he had wounded her, but in this week he had not hurt her once, nor had he hurt Uncle Robert. Regarding this latter he had influenced a review of Wings and Winds, which had given the author the greatest pleasure. Philip had something to bear on this count, for Uncle Robert flaunted the review in his face, declaring that here was a reviewer, on a good paper too, who did not take Philip's view of the verses. But Philip took all this well. He must behave so as to gain Miss Le Breton's good opinion. She would know nothing of all this, yet he felt that she would read him when next they met, with those searching eyes of hers. She would know he was trying to improve himself. Dan had called in to see them, full of high spirits, when he was on his way to the White House, and Philip had felt a great dejection come over him. Dan must be pretty sure of his ground, or he would not be in such high spirits. Another thing had happened during this week. Colonel Henderson had passed away. Uncle Robert, who was as full of impulse as his nephew, in his own way, had insisted on Mrs. Henderson and the two boys, Will and Eric, coming to Hawk's Nest. The boys shall go to Brighton College, he said, and then to Sandhurst. There is no one to interfere, for I got Lane to see that Henderson made a will leaving me guardian, that is, joint guardian with him, which means that I shall have a free hand. Philip, at this time, had ample opportunity of studying his uncle's character afresh, and he decided that the old fellow, on whom he had often looked with something very nearly approaching contempt, was one of the noblest men he had ever known. The joy which brimmed over, in finding an outlet for his unselfish kindliness, was a thing to remember. "There is the room that Dan used to paint in, Annie," spluttered Uncle Robert, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. "The boys could have that for a playroom. I can get some tools, and some wood, and a lathe. We should not hear the lathe much up there. The big cupboard with drawers underneath would be very handy for the boys. Mrs. Henderson can have the other big attic to stow away her furniture, if she wishes to keep it. It is a ramshackle lot, Lane says, but still she may like to keep it. Women get attached to these things. Mrs. Henderson should have a room for herself with a south aspect. What a good thing Hawk's Nest is so roomy!" Philip saw all these preparations going on, and saw that his mother went hand in glove with his uncle in the matter. He marveled that she, with her dainty ways, should be so willing to suffer such an invasion of her home. Will and Eric the colonel had called destroying angels, and Mrs. Henderson, by his accounts, was a broken-hearted creature who would be a very wet blanket. True brother and sister, both were always forgetting self. All at once, it had been when Philip had noticed his mother trying to smooth out the lovely natural wave of her hair, Philip began to actually realize that he, in his domineering arrogance, had closed the door of happiness to his beautiful mother. Her youthful aspect struck her son more forcefully than ever in the plain gown she had affected, he knew, just to meet his wishes. Her charming figure was emphasized by the plain, well-fitting bodice. Philip felt guilty as he watched his mother smoothing her hair. It seemed to him he was always feeling guilty lately. "Mother," he said abruptly, as he fingered the pretty silver objects on her toilet table. He had strolled into her room and seated himself on a chintz-covered chair while she got ready to go out with him. "Mother, don't brush that wave out. I like it. It is so pretty." "You dear!" she exclaimed, laughing and blushing. "But you know you think it almost a crime for the mother of a grown-up son to look pretty." "I think," affirmed Philip humbly, "that I have been a dictatorial ass. I must have made you very unhappy often, Mother. Can you forgive me?" She turned shining eyes upon him, eyes that had never looked but in love upon him, from the time when he had first lain upon her breast. She had been almost a child herself, then. "You are my own boy," she said. "There can never be any question of forgiving between us." She laughed a little, though tears stood in her eyes. "I am afraid I do look absurdly young, Philip. And I feel young, which is more. I don't think I really felt so young when I was Annie Burns." Philip passed an arm about her as he kissed her cheek. "It would be hard to lose you, Mother," he told her. "Silly boy! Do I look like dying?" she asked. "I did not mean that," he rejoined. Then he ceased abruptly. She went to the big wardrobe that occupied almost the entire side of her room. She was going to choose a hat to put on. "Put on a pretty one," said Philip. "And, Mother, why don't you have a black one with a big white ostrich feather? I think that looks A1." She glanced at him sharply. She recalled at once, with a pang, the wearer of the hat her son was thinking of. She knew of Dan's infatuation for Miss Le Breton. Surely her beloved boy was not going to suffer a second martyrdom. That would be too cruel. Amy Le Breton was not only a very beautiful and charming woman, but she was like Uretta. It was fearfully possible that Philip should fall in love with her, and that he should discover that she loved Dan Webster. Alvin, too, appeared to be encouraging Dan. Oh, it would be too sad, too horribly cruel. She stood with the hat she had chosen to wear in her hand, and seemed to hesitate. "You don't answer, Mother," persisted Philip. "Did you not like Miss Le Breton's hat? I found it charming." "Yes, dear, I did admire it very much," she answered as she came to the toilet table in quest of hat pins. "And Miss Le Breton? Do you admire her?" demanded Philip. "Exceedingly," answered the mother. "I think," she added, inflicting a wound to save a greater, "I think we shall hear of an engagement between her and Dan soon. Dan is, of course, in love with her, and she seems fond of him." Philip had already known and fully realized this, but somehow his mother's words stung him to the quick. Why? He asked himself. What difference could it make to him, since he was altogether out of the running? Miss Le Breton had been kind to him, but if there were no Dan, he felt she would not be 1 inch nearer to him, Philip. Still, he was free to admire, even to worship at the shrine of Dan's Madonna at a discreet distance. Even Dan could not object to that. As for Dan, he had "gone up like a rocket to come down like a stick," as he told his sister Isabel. But Philip knew nothing of this, nor did he for many a day. Philip got an idea for a new book while he was walking with his mother on the seafront, and he delighted his mother by talking it out with her, a thing he had never done before. She, dear woman, was all admiration and sympathy, though Philip's outlined plot was not very clear to her. Of course, it would be a fine book, quite Philip's best. End of chapter 40. Read by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona, March 19, 2023.
Chapter 41 of The 13th Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Joseph Dinsmore. The 13th Man by Mrs. Coulson Kernahan. A Testimonial to Miss Linkin. Mrs. Webster and Miss Linkin had been much upset by Dan's going to the White House. Of course, it could have but one meaning, that Canadian minks had laid snares for him. They would certainly lose their Dan. Equally, of course, the marriage would be most unhappy. "Why?" Isabel had asked when Aunt Lizzie had ventilated this opinion. "Can the leopard mate with the lamb?" Miss Linkin had solemnly demanded, and Isabel had burst forth into amused and aggravated laughter. "I don't see the connection," she had said. But when Dan returned from his visit, he looked so utterly dejected that his mother and aunt took heart at once. It was only Isabel who looked troubled and concerned. As soon as an oppressive meal was ended, Isabel followed her brother to his studio. "What is it, Dan?" she asked anxiously, when Dan had lit the gas fire and drawn up 2 wicker chairs. "Can't you guess, Isabel?" he groaned. "I think so, dear, but is it inevitable?" "Quite. Yet one never knows. A woman sometimes says no when she means yes." "But not a woman like Amy Lee Breton." "I made too sure," said Dan miserably. "I went up like a rocket, and I have come down like a stick. Of course, she is miles too good for me. I knew that all along." "Is there someone else?" asked Isabel. "Oh, no," answered Dan. "She is not going to marry. Oh, she is the sort of woman to remain a virgin. So pure, so beautiful. Our Blessed Lady must have had a look like hers. Oh, if you could have seen her! Her sweet compassion, her sublime dignity. She is not for me, or for any man. What a blind fool I was. And I gave her pain. I saw that she suffered to see me suffer. I ought to have known. Yes, I certainly ought to have spared her. I had a sense of having committed sacrilege in offering myself to her. That was how I felt about it, how I shall always feel about it. There are women who are like angels, and to ask such to marry is a sacrilege. She, Miss Le Breton, is the kind of woman who becomes a nun, and I was too blind to see it, though I, of all people, ought to have known it, for I painted her very soul in my Madonna. But I do not regret having met her, though it has well nigh broken my heart. I shall be a better man for having known such a beautiful, pure nature. For her sake I shall live purely, and strive for ideals that she has done for me. So, sister mine, don't shed tears." Isabel was crying, but in the sitting room Miss Linkin was triumphant. "She has refused him," she cried exultantly to her sister. "What a deliverance!" ejaculated Miss Webster devoutly. "And do see that my hot water bottle is hot tonight. Marianne does not boil the water, I am sure of it. Yes, it is a deliverance. I think that Dan might wait till his poor mother is underground before wanting to marry. It won't be too long, anyway." "Creaking doors hang the longest, Maria," replied Miss Linkin. "You've been a poor creature ever since Isabel was born, and you are not gone yet." "That has nothing to do with it," rejoined Miss Webster. "I am nearing my 60 years and 10, the allotted time of man." "You never were any good at arithmetic, Maria," retorted her sister, nodding and making the corkscrew curls dance. "You were 54 last birthday." "That has nothing at all to do with it," again asserted Miss Webster. "Keep to the point, Lizzie. Dan might wait for a wife till his mother is gone. What does he want with a wife? He has a comfortable home, well looked after." The last clause had the effect of putting Miss Linkin in good humor. There were times, a great many times, when Mrs. Webster irritated her. Mrs. Webster had never been much of a housekeeper, even in her days of health, while her sister had a born gift that way. She had a born gift, too, for industry. She was never a moment idle. At this particular moment, she was putting fine darns into a damask tablecloth, which under Miss Webster's regime would have long since been consigned to the rag bag. "Yes, Maria," said Miss Linkin, "Dan's home may not exactly be luxurious, but it is well kept, and Dan is certainly getting on. He has earned quite a lot of money with his portraits, and has a lot of commissions." "That is all very well, Lizzie," broke in Mrs. Webster querulously, "but Dan's eyes may go wrong again." "You always were a prophet of evil, Maria," snapped Miss Linkin, whom the last remark had irritated. "You never see the bright side of anything." "What a wicked untruth," rejoined Mrs. Webster. "Didn't I see the bright side of Dan's disappointment?" "Oh, that!" replied her sister scornfully. "And now I suppose we shall have Dan moping about the place, making everybody miserable. I have no patience with that kind of thing. People ought to consume their own smoke. I am sure this horrible November winter gets into my joints most distressingly. If Dan had not gone in for art, he might have had enough money by now for me to winter in the south of France. There is an awful draught from that window when the door is open, and Mary Ann leaves it open every time she comes in. It wants a new lock, said Miss Lincoln. Dan says I can have it seen to. I think, considering my health, it might have been seen to before, Mrs. Webster complained, and my chair is just opposite the door. Well, why not have your chair moved to the other side? Inquired Miss Lincoln, not unnaturally. I am used to this side of the fireplace, said Mrs. Webster. People at my time of life don't make changes. I want to go to the south of France. You just said you didn't like changes, her sister reminded her. That has nothing at all to do with it, replied Mrs. Webster conclusively. Miss Lincoln sniffed. Mrs. Webster glanced at the clock over the mantelpiece and remarked, Dan and Isabel have been away in that studio 3 parts of an hour. I must say, my children are not much comfort to me. You would have thought that Dan would have tried to entertain me a little after being away enjoying himself. But no, he must needs to go to that studio with Isabel. My company is not sufficiently entertaining, I suppose. At that very moment, Dan came in, followed by Isabel. He was making a valiant effort to appear cheerful. Oh, please close the door, Dan, were Mrs. Webster's first words. Then, as he was about to obey, she added, But never mind, I am just going to bed. But you don't usually go to bed so early, said Dan. Hope you are not feeling less well. I am never well, replied his mother. But not worse tonight, I hope, said Dan, pulling up a chair near her. More tired of waiting, she answered. Waiting? Do you mean for us? Asked Dan. I am so sorry. If I had had an idea. That is just it, Dan. Modern sons and daughters never seem to have an idea. When your Aunt Lizzie and I were girls, we were devoted to our parents. Dan looked troubled. Isabel spoke. Oh, don't talk like that, Mother. No son could be more devoted than Dan. That is your way of looking at it, said Mrs. Webster. Dan has been with you nearly an hour, and he comes to sit with his mother just at bedtime. Miss Lincoln jerkily folded up her work, remarking something about silly nonsense. Don't go to bed yet, Mother, said Dan, ignoring her reproaches. I want to tell you about my visit to Gissing. It will amuse you. I am past being amused, said Mrs. Webster. When I die, I should like to be buried where— Oh, for the Lord's sake, broke out Dan. Well, Dan, said Mrs. Webster, all I can say is that you Catholics are shockingly profane. Dear Mother, let us talk of something else, said Dan. For instance, the drives you are going to have. I can afford them now, and you must go out and get the air. November air, Dulwich November air. How can you talk of it, Dan? This part of the village is full of damp and fog, Mrs. Webster complained ungraciously. If I could be in the south of France. I wonder if it could be managed, said Dan. We must get into figures. I don't see why you couldn't go. But I should have to take your Aunt Lizzie to look after me, and there would be no one to take care of the house. If Isabel had not been so obstinate about doing schoolwork, she might have attended to her mother. You are tired and ill, or you would not talk so, Mother, Dan told her. You know how pluckily Isabel went out to earn because I made so little, but she need not now. Isabel intervened. I shall not have to leave the James Allen, Dan, however much you get on. I like the independence too well to give it up. Moreover, Aunt Lizzie looks after Mother far better than I could. There is no reason why Mother and Aunt Lizzie should not go to the south of France if you can manage it. Mary Ann couldn't look after us well enough. Mrs. Webster began to shed tears at this point. It is hard that my children should want to get rid of me and banish me to a foreign land, she said in a faltering voice. You both want to give me far away. Well, I suppose I am no trouble. The house would be a lot brighter without me. Let me go, and if my bones have to be laid in a foreign soil, I suppose it won't much matter, though I have picked the spot in Norwood Cemetery where I would desire to be laid. Maria, come to bed. Miss Lincoln spoke with some severity. Mrs. Webster rose, obedient to the voice of her sister, and walked with a bent head towards the door. Your Aunt Lizzie is the only one who troubles much about me, she said as she quitted the room without even a good night to her children. Take care, Maria, how you walk. You are treading on the front of your dress, Miss Lincoln said in a loud voice as the sisters mounted the staircase. Dan and Isabel exchanged despairing glances. The scene which had just enacted was not new to them. A little real ill health, and a great deal of imaginary ill health, had made Miss Webster a most unreasonable and aggravated woman, yet both Isabel and Dan knew that she loved them both. It is poor Aunt Lizzie who has most to bear, said Isabel to her brother. Both you and I get away from it all, but Aunt Lizzie has it night and day and every night and every day. Aunt Lizzie ought to have no purgatory. She has had it here. I could never put up with it without a break, as she does. I can't help admiring her. She never varies. Every day she goes through her self-imposed tasks. She has nothing whatever to brighten her drab life, and she never grumbles. I don't think any of us know quite what a heroine she has been through the years. Quite true, agreed Dan. We can all be patient and heroic by fits and starts. But Aunt Lizzie keeps on being patient and heroic. She puts some of us to shame. End of chapter 41.
Chapter 42 of The 13th Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Winnifred Assmann. The 13th Man by Mrs. Coulson Kernahan. How Reputations Are Ruined. Miss Le Breton began to be a much talked-of young woman in Hastings, and even Bexhill, on account of her wonderful horsemanship. She, with her uncle, had gone to the first meet of the Bexhill Harriers, and her portrait on her splendid mare, Black Bess, had got into the Hastings and St. Leonard's Pictorial Advertiser. People began to leave cards at the White House, but disappointment awaited them, especially perhaps the men. For Mr. Alvin made it well understood that they wished to live a quiet and retired life, and the calls, with the exception of the Barrimores and the Picketts, were not returned. But no one had a word to say against Thomas Alvin, for he was found to be most liberal to local charities. Alvin never gave anything, however, without consulting his niece. "The money is yours, not mine," he would say to her. But she would answer, "Ours, uncle." In these days Alvin was happier than he had ever been in all his ill-starred life, but he often suffered acutely. There were days when he never emerged from the little wood where no one but himself ever entered. He could not forgive himself for the crime he had committed, though his victim had forgiven him. He was now much troubled about Euretta. She had refused Dan Webster's offer, and she had told him in so many words that she no longer loved Philip. What was to become of her when he and Mrs. Le Breton were gone? She would have money, certainly, but Alvin wanted for her to be a happy wife and mother. It was at her instigation that he had discouraged callers. How would she meet with a man she could marry if she insisted upon isolation? He had noticed again and again, notably at that first meet of the Bexhill Harriers, how much admiration she had excited. But she was firm in her resolve. "I am quite happy, uncle," she would say. She spoke the truth, for though she felt that her romance of love was over, and that Philip had resigned himself to the loss of the girl he had once so passionately loved, still she had the joy of seeing Philip become more the old Philip of her love. He was conquering that hardness, that care for social advancement which had so spoiled him. She had a curious feeling that she was indeed dead, and was watching Philip from another world. Perhaps she might help him. She had first found the pure joy that being a helper brings in seeing Mrs. Le Breton become more cheerful under her influence. Mrs. Le Breton had had an utterly hopeless expression in the first months, but now she could even laugh. Then Euretta had helped Alvin. She was always on the lookout for him after one of his days shut up in the little wood. He was sure of finding her at the gate that led from the wood to the garden, even though November mists lay thick about the bushes. She would slip her arm through the rough colonials and tell him she had missed him. What this meant to the ill-starred 13th man, he alone knew, nor did he himself realize to the full. Euretta was the first woman who had ever cared for him or seen any good in him. Sometimes he suffered a kind of agony of dumbness. He longed so much to make her understand how he worshipped her, and no words seemed worth anything. He would gladly have died to give her a happiness. All the love which had found no object during his whole life till he had known Euretta concentrated now on the beautiful girl, the girl he had so wronged. One day, it was after one of those retreats to the little wood, Alvin told Euretta that his wrong to her had given him hell. "Don't let it do so any more, dear uncle," she said. "So much good has come out of evil. But for that wrong I should not have had your love and poor Mrs. Le Breton's. You would never have found out how much I love you, and Mrs. Le Breton would have pined away alone in the prairie." "But you lost your lover," he reminded her. She gave one of those mystical smiles which had moved Dan so much. "I lost the Philip that was," she said. "Had he married me, as he would have done had he not thought me dead, We might not have been happy. Philip had passion for me. It remained to be proved if that passion would ever become steady love. But we know now that there was nothing at all between him and Miss Lane, Alvin said. You thought them lovers. My instinct played me false there, acknowledged Eureka. But you heard the sentiments expressed in the book. You mean about the man deciding to marry a woman who would help him socially? Yes, answered Eureka. The man in Philip's book placed a literary success before love. That book is burned, Alvin reminded her. Yes, and more was burned with it, I suspect, she replied enigmatically. Eureka's helpfulness was not confined to the White House. The old priest at St. Mary, Star of the Sea, had only to let Miss Le Breton know of a sad case of poverty to find it relieved. She never appeared herself in such matters. She helped the poor through the old priest. Father Donnelly thought Miss Le Breton a saint. She did not do her good works before men to get praise of them. She lived a simple, pious life. She accused herself in the confessional of want of gratitude for a sorrow which had come to her, of course, for her good. Eureka had, indeed, struggled to thank God for the loss of her lover. She had, at one time, bitterly rebelled. She had so loved Philip. The rebellion was ended, but she had not come yet to be grateful to God for the sorrow, which she, simple soul that she was, felt that she ought to do. The poor little saint was very human. One of Eureka's greatest admirers was Minnie Pickett. She had persuaded Minnie to confess her love affair with the clerk from the gasworks, and not practice a deception on her parents. Perhaps we never love anyone quite so really as the man or woman who leads us to abandon a fault or to rise to ideals. Minnie loved Eureka because her influence was all towards the highest and best. And Minnie had found that she had lost nothing by being open and aboveboard with her parents. After an inquiry into the character of Minnie's lover, Mr. Pickett had consented to the engagement, and the young man was allowed to pay stated visits to the farm. Eureka often went to Pickett's farm, but never when Mrs. Hannington was there if she knew it. She disliked Mrs. Hannington exceedingly, for on the one occasion when she had met her, that lady had scandalized both Philip and Phyllis, and Eureka had told her exactly what she thought of her, which had not been pleasant for Mrs. Hannington to listen to. Mrs. Hannington had from that time added hatred of Miss Le Breton to her other iniquities, and far from curbing her love of tearing people's characters to pieces, had found a new victim in Miss Le Breton. Colonel Lane had put an announcement of his daughter's going to join her husband in India in the Hastings Observer to stop the talk. It had been carefully worded and appeared like social news. Of course, Mrs. Hannington had her say on the subject, though not at Pickett's farm. She confided to all her numerous acquaintances, with this one exception, that Colonel Lane was pretty artful, but that he couldn't deceive her. Of course, he had sent that notice to the paper to hoodwink Hastings folk. There was a reason for Miss Lane having to clear out, and it was a pity she hadn't a husband. The only thing was to smuggle her out of the country and hide her shame. The colonel was as bad as his daughter. Look how he stayed away from home. Then again, who was the woman he had foisted off on the unsuspecting Barrimores? A woman with 2 boys, too. No doubt the boys were Colonel Lane's own. All men led double lives, only some of them didn't get found out. As for Mr. Philip Barrimore, it was to be hoped he would get his deserts for being the ruin of a young girl. And he was friendly with the White House people. What sort of people were they? Coming from no one knew where. And why did they keep so much to themselves if they had not some guilty secret? Miss Le Breton, with all her pretended virtue, had been shut up for hours with that young Mr. Webster. That she knew for a fact. And artists were always on far too intimate terms with their models. Miss Le Breton would be going off to India to join her husband next. After this kind of tirade, Mrs. Hannington usually ended up by thanking God she was not as other women. Mr. Hannington had his own opinion upon this point, and he did not thank God that his wife was not as other women. Indeed, he had been heard to express the wish that she could be like any woman he knew, except herself. End of chapter 42.
Chapter 43 of The 13th Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Brandon. The 13th Man by Mrs. Coulson Kernahan. A Miraculous Medicine. There had been a military funeral at the cemetery at Orr. It was the band sergeant of the Rifles, who had served in the local artillery and rifles for 34 years, and he was buried with full military honors. Colonel Lane had gone to the funeral, for he had known and liked Band Sergeant Dean. It was a bitterly cold day, and Colonel Lane was not well. His health had failed a good deal since his daughter had left him. When the comrades of the band sergeant fired a volley over the grave, Colonel Lane was seen to stagger, and but for the timely aid of a friendly hand would have fallen. He was taken home unconscious. Mrs. Ransom had sent at once to Hawk's Nest and to Dr. Nansel. It was Mrs. Barrimore who first arrived with Mr. Burns. Uncle Robert, who read his sister's eyes, insisted that she should remain. "You will stay till he is well," announced Uncle Robert. "No one on earth is so good a nurse as you, and Mrs. Henderson will look after Hawk's Nest. It will do her good to have something to see to, so you need not worry in the least. The boys will keep me occupied." Mrs. Ransom, far from being affronted by the proposal Mr. Burns made, was much relieved by it. The colonel was a bit of a handful when he was well, and goodness knows what he would be like ill, she said. But Colonel Lane was not even a bit of a handful, as it turned out. He was very ill indeed, and was as patient as very ill persons usually are. Dr. Nansel insisted on a professional nurse, but said that Mrs. Barrymore might share the work with her. Dr. Nansel described the case as complicated. The heart was very weak. There had been at one time abscess of the liver, contracted in India. But nervous breakdown of a very serious character was the cause of the present mischief. The condition of the heart was such that death might ensue. Evidently the colonel had held up till he literally dropped. Careful nursing and the enforced rest might bring him round, but Anglo-Indians slipped through the fingers in a most amazing way. They had nearly always some undeclared mischief which asserted itself with direful results when illness from another cause overtook them. Anglo-Indians were a bag of tricks. Still, of course, there was hope. What Anne Barrymore suffered in the days that followed, only God knew. Philip, for whom she had sacrificed this man's happiness and her own, was now quite in the background. The mother love, which had been so intensely strong in her, gave place now to the passionate love she felt for the man who was apparently dying before her eyes. Had she married him, this would not have happened. She felt that she had murdered him she loved best. She knew now what she had not known before, that her love for this man was greater than her love for her son. Yet this was not really the case. The love was different, that was all. Most days when the trained nurse was in charge, Uncle Robert fetched his sister to take a few hours' rest in her home. He was not without fear that she would break down, but he felt he had chosen the lesser evil, for she would never have borne to be kept away from the beloved patient. On one of these brief visits home, she found Philip there, and Philip saw a side of her he had never suspected. In fact, that he would never have believed could exist in one so uniformly gentle. Mrs. Barrymore was cross and irritable. When he offered the usual caress, she put him from her, asking to be let alone. Philip was much hurt, but he recalled many occasions on which he had repulsed his mother and he realized now what it must have meant to her. Mrs. Barrimore was in her Gethsemane at this time, for Colonel Lane was too ill even to give a sign that he knew she was near him. His consciousness was clouded, and he was often so still that she had thought he had passed away. Uncle Robert had insisted on Sir Samuel Ferguson being called in, but he had apparently been mystified by the case, and had had the honesty to say so. He, however, had expressed the opinion that the colonel might recover, and had insisted on constant nourishment. Fortunately, the patient could swallow what was given to him, and did not resist the food, which, of course, took a liquid form. Uncle Robert took a more hopeful view than anyone in the case. He declared that nature in Colonel Lane's case was insisting on absolute rest, even of the mental faculties. He had heard the colonel say that, after a campaign, he had once slept for 4 days and nights without waking, and had been perfectly well at the end of that time, all the weariness of war gone. Uncle Robert cited other cases he knew of, where loss of sleep had always been made up. His own mother had, after a week of day and night nursing, spent most of the week in sleep. Now the colonel had been on a great strain for a long time. He had spent himself for his friend Henderson. He had been ceaselessly worrying about his daughter also, and Uncle Robert put this first. He had been condemned to resign the one woman who could have made him happy. Was it any wonder that he should be in his present position? Uncle Robert put all this to Philip after his mother had gone back to Colonel Lane. "Uncle, I don't know how it is, but lately it has been brought home to me that I have been a thorn in the flesh to everyone." Uncle Robert simply stared at his nephew. "I wonder," went on Philip, "that any of you can stand me at any price. I was simply beastly about your book, and I was unutterably selfish about my mother and Colonel Lane. I put my great barge of a foot down and prevented the happiness of those two. Now it is too late." "I'm not so sure of that," said Uncle Robert. "I have an idea that you have it in your power to administer the most potent medicine in Colonel Lane's case." "Then, by heaven, I will do it," cried Philip, understanding. "I will go right off now and see my mother." "There is no time like the present," Uncle Robert affirmed. "I will get my hat and go with you as far as the door. A blow on the West Hill will do me good. I miss my swims at this time of the year." When you get about halfway down Salter's Lane, you come upon a quiet backwater of a road, in which are old substantial houses, with big sloping gardens, where century-old trees are bird-haunted. In one of these houses near the end of the road which is nearest to St. Clement's Church, Colonel Lane lived. On the opposite side was the Heritage, where some nuns who had been banished from France lived, whom Uretta had found out to their advantage. At the small gate that led into the garden of Colonel Lane's house, Uncle Robert left his nephew. Philip climbed the narrow steps and then the steep path, bordered still by gloriously colored chrysanthemums, and knocked upon the old-fashioned door softly. He would not ring. Mrs. Ransom opened the door. "He is slightly better, sir," she whispered excitedly. "He smiled at your mother when she came in. It is the first notice he has taken of anybody." "Is she with him now? Do you think I could see her for 2 minutes?" Philip asked. "Ask her, sir," answered Mrs. Ransom with some hesitation. "But she is not over willing to leave him, even to get necessary rest." "It is very important," urged Philip, whereupon Mrs. Ransom asked the young man into the dining room and went noiselessly upstairs. "What is it, Philip?" asked Mrs. Barrimore, turning tired eyes on her son. "Mother," began Philip tenderly, I've thought of a new medicine for Colonel Lane." "Everything has been tried, Philip." He seemed slightly better. "Not everything, Mother," rejoined Philip. "The medicine I am thinking of will cure him." She made a little gesture of impatience. But for Philip all this sorrow might have been spared, she was telling herself. "Mother," said Philip, taking her slim hand within both his and looking affectionately at her, "the medicine I mean is yourself." She looked up with startled eyes. "Do you mean—" she began. "I mean," said Philip firmly, "that you must tell him you will marry him when he gets well." End of chapter 43.
Chapter 44 of the 13th Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The 13th Man by Mrs. Coulson Kernahan. How an edition of Wings and Winds was sold. Philip returned to Hawk's Nest by runs and leaps, a thing so unusual with him, for Philip was naturally indolent, that when his uncle, who was instructing the gardener about some new planting out, saw his nephew exhibiting such energy, he thought, for a moment, that the boy had taken leave of his senses. "Ah, Philip!" he exclaimed. "What says our friend Cicero? Potest exercitatio et temperantia etiam in senectude conservare alicid pristina roboris." Exercise and temperance can preserve something of our early youth, even in old age. You are starting exercise at last. But what news are you bringing that you run? Philip was panting and struggling for breath. At last he said, "You were quite right, Uncle. I said my say and I went, and I had not reached the top of Salter's Lane before I heard steps behind me, running. It was my mother. Heavens, but what a girl she looked! She told me that I had performed a miracle and then fled back to the dear patient. Uncle, I am in for a stepfather, and one who is not always sweet-tempered. There will be great changes for you, too, Uncle. I should think you had better take on Mrs. Ransom when Mother goes." "And what is to prevent Mrs. Henderson from having the post?" inquired Uncle Robert, as he pushed a cake of mud off his boot with a stick. "She is keeping house now, and doing it well, though Lane did think she was not much of a manager. Poor soul! She seems twice as happy being occupied. Between you and me, Philip, Lane never did see further than his nose. Look how little Phil hoodwinked him! And Mrs. Henderson had never a chance with a sick husband and two healthy, unruly boys, and a house where the very doorknobs were off, and no money to speak of. Philip, don't step on that bed. There are bulbs in it. Mrs. Henderson is a very intelligent woman. She admires Wings and Winds, and can quote my verses. Speaking of those same verses, I heard from the publisher today that the whole edition was sold out. Think of that, my boy! The verses can't be so bad as you thought them." "I am tremendously pleased, Uncle," said Philip, backing on the bulbs again. He was extremely puzzled all the same. "Look here, Philip," cried Uncle Robert. "You had better come in. You do nothing but trample down my beds, and the path is wide enough, I should think. Luncheon must be ready. Just notice how much brighter Mrs. Henderson is looking, despite her dismal garb. She is not bad-looking either. Her gray hair becomes her." "I must get back, Uncle, thank you," said Philip. "I asked for soda to be brought round by 2:00. "But you must eat your luncheon, man." But Philip was obdurate. He knew that Alvin and Miss Le Breton were in Hastings, and that they were writing. He knew, too, that they would be returning about 2:00, and he meant to join them, as if by accident. He knew nothing of Dan's ill success with his Madonna, and firmly believed the two young people were now engaged. But he saw no reason why he should not pick up a few of the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. He had got his own lonely life to lead, and now his work did not fill his life any longer. It did not satisfy the craving for love and sympathy. He found that the world he had created for himself was a very lonely world indeed, yet so short a time ago he had imagined it all sufficient. The isolation of the bungalow had begun to be hard to endure. He felt it rather a grievance, too, that new people should be at Hawk's Nest. It was an invasion of his home. Home? It would never be home again, with his mother gone. His mother, whom he had never valued half enough. Truly, his world seemed to have crumbled away about him. If Yoretta had only lived! How different it all might have been. If only Dan had not been in the running. But he must never think of that. Miss Le Breton, so like to Yoretta, but more than Yoretta had ever been in some ways. Yoretta had never that sweet calm which made her half-sister so restful. How desirable she was. How Philip wanted rest. From what? From himself. Philip rode slowly in the direction of Gissing, so that he had only got as far as Orr Church, when he heard the welcome clatter of horses' hoofs behind him, and, drawing rein, waited for Miss Le Breton and Alvin to overtake him. Philip uncovered as they came up. "Hello, Barrimore!" called Alvin. "You are the man in my mind. There are animated pictures, all Canadian, tonight at the public hall at 8:00. We are all driving in to see them, and there is a spare place. Won't you come with us? You know a little Canada, too. For us, it will be like going home." There was a curious choke in the colonial's voice, which did not escape Philip. "Yes, do come, Mr. Barrimore," said Miss Le Breton. That decided Philip. "I should much enjoy it," he said. "It is very kind of you to ask me to go with you." "You had better come back with us and have dinner. We are going to dine at 5:00 and dispense with tea today. Neither of us has had much luncheon, so we shall have a good appetite, I hope. But you—" "I have not lunched at all," Philip told them, "so I shall be able to do justice to dinner, though it is early. I will come in about 4:30 if I may." "Come as early as you like," said Alvin. The talk on the way was all of Canada, and Philip found himself wondering why Alvin had come to England, since he had apparently left his heart in Canada. They walked their horses abreast, unless the coming of a vehicle made it necessary to fall out of line, and it was Alvin who did most of the talking. "This time of year I should be hauling wheat into Broadview, as likely as not, if I were back in Canada," he said. "I came over at the end of November, the only other time I came to England. I was batching with a young fellow then. Lord, how we worked to get all rounded up! We were loading all the Sunday, I remember. We took about 500 bushels of wheat to Broadview and put a new floor in the granary, got in and cut up the wood, lined up the shack, deepened and cribbed the wells, all within the inside of a fortnight and the temperature below zero." "I should think you feel yourself well out of all of that," suggested Philip. "No, it sounds queer, but I don't. I am always thinking what they are doing now out there. The true Canadian loves Canada as the Irish love Ireland. I don't mean the sort that get dumped down there from England, cheeky, uppish, lazy chaps that turn tail at a bit of work. I mean Canadians." "But some Englishmen seem to get on in Canada," ventured Philip. "The right sort do," acknowledged the colonial, "but the right sort would get on anywhere." They parted company at the bungalow, and Philip went over to the White House later. He was taken into the drawing room by Mattie, where he found himself alone. His eyes wandered round the room and fell on an enormous unopened parcel addressed to Miss Le Breton. On the big white label was the name of Uncle Robert's publisher. Then Philip understood how a whole edition of Wings and Winds had been sold. End of Chapter 44. Read by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona, February 12, 2023. Chapter 45 of The 13th Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The 13th Man by Mrs. Coulson Kernahan. How a Scandal-Monger was served. To have voluntarily exiled oneself, and to find when one wishes to return that every door is closed against one, is not a pleasant experience. Philip Barrimore realized that, in leaving Hawk's Nest, he had not only done it of his own free will, but against the wishes of all concerned. Now, though he could certainly go back and take possession of his old room if he would, yet the door of the old home was closed against him. Or, to put the thing more plainly, the old home no longer existed. Mrs. Henderson and her boys were installed there. His mother would be going away. Hawk's Nest remained, but the home was practically gone. In the story Philip had read aloud at the White House, he had ventilated views which had closed another door to him, the door of love. Dan, wise Dan, had entered at that door, so Philip thought. The bungalow became a horror of loneliness. Philip tried to work, but no ideas came. He would go out on soda, coming home wearied, but not refreshed. At night, he invariably walked across the field and looked upon the White House. Often he saw the light of Alvin's lantern going to the little wood. Always he saw the light through the blind of the window he had accidentally learned was Miss Le Breton's. Another fact he had definitely learned. It had been on the drive home to Gissing, after the animated picture show at the public hall, was that he loved Euretta's half-sister, more passionately even than he had ever loved Euretta. And she was also lost to him. He was stranded, a lonely man who was now starving for love and sympathy. In his mother's happiness, which was indirectly of his making, he had no part. Colonel Lane had never really liked him. A good many people did not like him, but Alvin seemed to do so. For this reason, Philip began to have an affection for the rough colonial. Uncle Robert's affection he had done his best to kill. True, Uncle Robert was always kind to him, but when had Uncle Robert ever been anything but kind to any human being? There was no comfort in going to Hawk's Nest now. Those two boys, Eric and Will, played tricks on him. Why were they not sent to Brighton College yet? They were not going till after Christmas. They turned Hawk's Nest into a pandemonium, and Uncle Robert seemed to like it. 2 or 3 nights a week he took those boys to the Hippodrome. The mother was home again. She was preparing for her wedding, and Colonel Lane was constantly there. Of course, Colonel Lane had got well as by a miracle. But Dan? How was it Dan did not turn up at the White House? Philip dreaded his coming, but he resented his absence. If he had been in Dan's shoes, he would have been again at the White House before now. It was strange, too, that Dan was never mentioned by Alvin. Once or twice, Philip had mentioned Dan to Alvin in hopes that he would say something about the engagement. Philip wanted to know if Miss Le Breton was happy about it, but he could not ask a direct question. At last a letter came from Dan. He wrote from Nice, where he said he had installed his mother and aunt for the winter. He said he had been seedy himself, but not one word of the Madonna. Could it be possible? No, he dared not think of it. Yet, would not Dan speak of his happiness if Miss Le Breton had accepted him? It was a dull November morning when Philip got Dan's letter. He could not rest, so he told Davis to get soda out, deciding to ride in to Hastings. As he was starting, Alvin rode up alone. He too was riding into Hastings and hailed the chance of Philip's company. "I heard from Dan Webster today," Philip said, as they rode side by side. He glanced at the Colonial furtively to see the effect of the announcement. "Poor Webster," muttered Alvin. Philip's heart bounded. Poor Webster? Why did Alvin say, poor Webster? "He was pretty hard hit, poor devil," went on Alvin. "I blundered, too. I thought my niece cared for him." Philip took off his cap and mopped his brow. "Where does he write from?" "He is in Nice with his mother and aunt. He is seedy," answered Philip, "but he says he is returning at once to work." "There is no understanding women," Alvin next said. "I think Amy means to remain unmarried. I should like her to marry some good man. Mrs. Le Breton could live with them. I should make that a condition, and I should go back to Canada." I thought I should like living a gentleman's life, as John did, but I don't. I would rather be in Canada and hire out." "But surely with all your money you would not need to hire out," laughed Philip. He was glad of an excuse to laugh out. He felt like shouting. It was all very well for Alvin to say his niece wanted to remain unmarried. She should not remain unmarried if Philip could help it. "You see," said Alvin uneasily, "I have been used to hard work all my life, and I am like a fish out of water." "But why hire out?" asked Philip. "Couldn't you buy a farm and work it?" "Young man, there are things you do not understand," Alvin told him a little curtly. Philip was silent. Alvin himself was silent too for some time. His thoughts, awakened by Philip's natural question, brought his sin vividly before him. He buy a farm, indeed! Was he not at this very moment living on Uretta's charity? He could not bear it. He was still strong and hearty. There were years more work in him. If only he could see Uretta happily married, he would then disappear. If only Uretta would let him confess his crime and give her her own identity, then he felt sure Philip would claim her. He had, that very morning, had a painful interview with a girl on this subject, but she obstinately refused to give him permission to speak. Alvin resolved to go to Father Donnelly, tell him the whole story, and beg him to use his influence with Uretta. She liked the old priest. Moreover, he could, if he would, use compulsion. Things could not go on as they were. The 13th man had, he felt, sold his soul to rid himself of his ill luck. Surely Uretta, as a good Catholic, would not wish him to remain with such a sin on his conscience, if Father Donnelly made her see it in its true light? Very little conversation took place between the two men after this. Each was full of his own thoughts. A diversion occurred as they came to Blacklands. A big crowd was gathered at the corner by the church. In the center of the crowd was a policeman, holding by the arm a bedraggled and dripping woman who was sobbing angrily while the crowd jeered. Alvin inquired of a man what was the matter. "Old Tom Jones has ducked a woman in the sea for slandering his wife," said the man, "and the bobby is seeing her home. Serve her right, the old cat. She's always spreading scandals about people." "I know that woman by sight," Philip remarked to Alvin. "I have seen her at Pickett's farm, but not just lately." "It must be that Mrs. Hannington," said Alvin. "Amy went for her at the farm because she was scandalizing someone. The Picketts have thrown her over." They rode on, parting at the gate of Hawk's Nest. "Come in tonight, won't you?" called Alvin as he rode off. "Thank you, I will," Philip called back. End of chapter 45. Read by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona, February 15, 2023. Chapter 46 of The 13th Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The 13th Man by Mrs. Coulson Kernahan. The mystery of the little wood revealed at last. Was it an accident that when Philip presented himself at the White House, Miss Le Breton should be alone to receive him? If so, it was a pretty lucky accident, thought the young man. Uretta was sitting idly by the bright wood fire, her slim hands folded in her lap. A strange tremor ran through Philip as she rose to meet him. He knew that she must have felt his hand tremble when he took hers. He began to babble strange words. "Forgive me, Miss Le Breton," he stammered. "I am not myself. Oh, you will scarcely think me sane when I tell you that, for the moment, I thought you were Uretta." "We are alike," she answered, becoming ashen pale. "Yes, but so different. Yet more than once I have seen Uretta looking out of your eyes." She turned her face away into shadow. "But why should that move you, since you have forgotten her? Or, at least, ceased to grieve for her?" she asked. "Miss Le Breton, I tried to forget her. Can you blame me? I could not have lived if I had let myself so remember. I am a man few like and fewer love. She loved me with all her soul. I lost her, but till I saw you, I can say my heart remained in her grave. Oh, I must speak. I must say what is in my heart, even if it is to call upon me bitter disappointment. I am unfaithful at last to her dear memory, for I love you. He came close to her and took her hand. Her face was turned from him. I love you, Amy, as I never loved Uretta, though God knows I loved her well. Until today, I thought I should never tell you this. Ah, I said I was unfaithful, but I think that was not true. You are Uretta, and yourself in one to me. It is as if my old love had risen from her grave, away in Capel, and come to me, nobler, greater, and more beautiful. If you can love me, then you can make of me something worthy. I have done many things just for your sake, tried to be better and conquer my faults. I have done this, though I thought you would never be anything to me. I have tried to act as you would approve if you knew. And, till today, I thought you belonged to another. Amy, will you be my good angel? Will you be Uretta to me? She turned shining eyes upon him, eyes brimming with tenderness, as she said, Yes, I will be Uretta to you. He caught her to him in a passionate embrace. Neither of them heard Alvin enter. They thought only of themselves and the heaven into which they had entered, till a heavy sob broke the silence, and both turned to see Alvin with his face hidden by his hands. "Uncle! Dear uncle!" cried Uretta, going to him swiftly. "I am going to do it," he exclaimed. "I am going to break my promise. Philip Barrimore, this is not Amy Le Breton. It is your own Uretta." Then he gasped for breath. Philip stared from one to the other in staggering bewilderment. "It was my sin, my own great sin," went on Alvin. Then, in a burst, he told the whole miserable story, finishing by saying, "Marry, my children, soon. I must wait to see that. Then I go back to the prairie." His face looked different from what they had ever seen it, from what anyone had ever seen it. It was happy. "I am no longer the ill-starred 13th man," he asserted. "I have been so fortunate as to see the lovers who were separated by my crime reunited, and the money of which I robbed an angel given back." Uretta flung her arms about her uncle's neck. She was no longer the calm Miss Le Breton. She was the old, impulsive Uretta, and was weeping unrestrainedly. "Uncle, dear uncle, you must not leave us and go back to the old, hard, lonely life. We want you, Philip and I, and no one must ever know this story. Strangers would not ever understand how you were hunted and driven always, how you never had a chance, how you thought yourself cursed from your birth, and that nothing seemed to matter. Strangers would not know that you had all the time a big, loving, starved heart, starved for love, that no one gave you, even your mother. But I love you, Uncle Thomas. I love you." The rough colonial's face had upon it a light indescribable as he said, "I unlucky? I who have found love? No, I am rich. I am fortunate. The prairies will be no more lonely. I shall live in this hour. But I must go. Yes, I must go. The prairie calls and calls." A wistful look came into Alvin's eyes, as if he were gazing on a far, far horizon. "Ah, I am homesick, homesick," he said in deep, lingering tones. "Homesick for the old, rough, wild life. How homesick you can neither of you know, even Uretta, for she never roughed it. I must leave you now, leave you to realize your happiness. Before you go, Philip," it was the first time that he had called the young man by his Christian name, "before you go, come to me in the little wood, and I will show you something. The gate will be open." Philip had not spoken one word. A war had been going on within him, a war of conflicting emotions. The affection which had, of late, been growing within him for Thomas Alvin was battling with anger and indignation at the crime of the man who had so nearly wrecked the happiness of himself and Uretta. "Philip," said Uretta, reading his thought, "we must be merciful if we are to expect mercy." "Dear heart," he said, drawing her once more into his arms, "you are right. You are always right. But why? Tell me why you did not disclose the secret to your old lover." Her eyes smiled. "At first I thought you had ceased to love you, Uretta. I wanted to see if you would love her again in the person of Amy Le Breton." "But how could I have been so blind as not to have known you under any disguise?" he cried. "Yet it is so simple," she told him. "You were assured of my death. You even went to Canada to see my grave. You knew I had a sister so marvelously like me as to be easily mistaken for me. You were told I was Amy Le Breton. Then again, sorrow robbed me of my old gaiety, changed my disposition. Oh, the delusion was easy enough to carry out." "It was carried out, in any case," he told her. "Yet there were moments when I saw the soul of my lost love looking out of your dear eyes. Oh, darling, a miracle has happened. And can you love a vain, cantankerous brute like me?" "I see deeper," she said simply. "The Philip I thought dead is alive again. We were both dead, dearest, and now we are alive." It was then that Philip brought the little ring from his waistcoat pocket, and once more it was placed on Uretta's finger. It was late when the lovers passed out of the house through the mist and the drooping bushes to the gate which led into the little wood. A strange sense of mystery seemed to enwrap them. They were to know, at last, what lay within the carefully guarded enclosure. A lantern stood upon a slab of stone at the open door, which was fixed in the high brick wall. They entered and saw. Within the walled enclosure was a roughly built shack or log cabin in which a light was burning. Alvin heard them and opened the door of the shack, inviting them to enter. A lamp burned upon a roughly constructed table in the one room, showing the meager contents: a table, a chair, and a bed. The bed was of rough boards nailed to the log wall, and, for a pillow, an old saddle did duty, aided by an old coat rolled up. A colored blanket and a rug made of tawny wolfskins, home-sewn, completed the bed furniture. Alvin offered the one chair to Uretta, requesting Philip to sit upon the bed. He himself sat on a block of wood somewhat like a butcher's block. In the full light of the lamp, the young people saw the colonial, really saw him as he was. He was wearing a shirt of dark flannel, open at the neck. He was also wearing jumpers. "You see now, don't you," said Alvin, "that I am homesick? I made myself a hidden refuge. I built a shack and, shut in there, tried to think myself back in the Northwest. There upon a nail hangs the gun that has been my companion for so many years." He took it down and laid it across his knees, caressing it with his hands. He talked on, and neither Uretta nor Philip interrupted him. "This gun has traveled many a mile slung behind the wagon, and I've brought down many a prairie chicken with it. You should see the prairie chickens feasting on the stooks. Ah, they are very good eating. I guess I'll be too late for the fall plowing, but I shall get a job, never fear. You won't keep me long waiting, will you? Now you have seen this? I can't go till I see you married, and you can see now how homesick I am." Philip was holding Uretta's hand. She was silently weeping. "I can't bear to think of your going back to that hard, lonely life, Uncle," she exclaimed. "At least, take enough money for some land and stock. For love of me, take that. I see well enough that you can't be happy here. But do, oh, do let me help you to make life easier out there." "You may lend me the fare out, Uretta," he answered. "I will repay it. Oh, I shall be able to repay it. I know that the 13th man will have luck from now. The spell is broken. I shall miss the threshing. Ah, the threshing gets quickly done. Over 1,000 bushels of wheat, or upwards of 2,000 bushels of oats in a day. Man, they go to sleep in this country." Alvin bared his brawny arm and looked at it. "This can work," he said. "Why, Once I pulled a cow out alone that had got buried under 2 settings of straw. It had burrowed where the separator had stood, and the straw had slid off the top with the weight of the snow and buried the poor beast. Thomas Alvin was, they saw, drunk with Canada this night. They saw that it would be cruelty to try to prevent his going back. They knew, moreover, that it would be useless to do so. Loretta came close to him and put her arms round his neck, her wet cheek against his. "But you will come back and see us, Uncle. You promise that?" And he promised. End of chapter 46. Read by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona, February 16, 2023. Chapter 47 of The 13th Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The 13th Man by Mrs. Coulson Kernahan. The Last. "All's well that ends well," quoted Mr. Burns from his easy chair. "So it's a boy, and mother and son doing well, eh? And what does Philip say? Doing the proud father? Eh? What?" Mrs. Lane, who had once been Annie Barrimore, had just come to Hawk's Nest from the White House, where a son had come for Loretta and Philip. It was again nearing the end of November, just a year since the events of the last chapter. "Oh, there is great rejoicing, I assure you," cried Mrs. Lane. "I came in to tell you before going home. And my dear Ted has such good news, too. Phyllis is most happy with her husband, and, according to Arbuthnot, is an altogether model wife. And I have yet another piece of news for you. Today is a day of good news, I think. That dear old Thomas Alvin has struck oil, he says in a letter. I don't know how exactly, but he has made money, and says he is coming over this fall to spend Christmas at the White House. I never shall understand how they all kept the secret of Loretta's identity, or why Loretta chose to personate her dead sister. I told her that her romantic idea of winning her lover for the second time in the person of Amy might have cost the poor fellow his life. But they are very happy, and, as you say, all's well that ends well. You know, don't you, that Philip's new book is out? Loretta says it will make her husband famous, and Philip says, not so famous as Dan's Madonna has made him." "Dan! Ah, you don't know the news about Dan," broke in Uncle Robert. "I got that today. He is going to marry a charming woman, the daughter of a big painter. I forget his name." Uncle Robert fumbled in his pocket to find the letter, but failed. "Anyway, the father of the girl is a big painter, and the girl has a pile of money, though Dan does not need it now. Mrs. Webster and Miss Linkin are going to take up their permanent abode at Nice, for Isabel, nice girl Isabel, is going to marry one of the masters at Dulwich College." "Oh, I am so glad," said Mrs. Lane. "Really, everything seems to be happening like a fairy tale. But I must hurry away to tell my news to Ted." Uncle Robert smiled to himself when his sister had gone. He smiled so much that Mrs. Henderson, who came in, was quite curious to know what was amusing him so, and asked him the question. "It's a poor heart that never rejoices," said Uncle Robert. "By the way, those boys will soon be home for their holidays. Sit down a minute. I am sure you have time, though you do seem always to have your hands full. I want to talk about the boys. We can only be young once, you know, though you seem to be picking up a second youth from somewhere. But that is not the point. I want to make those boys very happy these holidays. They have done extremely well at school, and they have done us credit. I want to give them something they greatly wish for, a Christmas present, you know, and I want to talk to you about it. You are a nervous little woman, you know, and you might find it alarming. The present, I mean, considering what daring young rascals those boys are, and I want to assure you that I shall take every necessary precaution to ensure their safety. I shall get their word that they will run no risks, and those boys understand honor, and their word will be quite sufficient. Also, I shall get a reliable man to accompany them. Now, don't you want to know what the present is?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled. She was, as she constantly was, overcome by this man's goodness and generosity. "I can't find words," she said. "You have been so good, so very good to us all. I—" "Tut, tut," said Uncle Robert. "I amuse myself in my own way. That is all. But the present? Well, I am going to buy a couple of pretty ponies and have a man from Russell's to teach Will and Eric to ride. It will be good for them, too, for they are to be soldiers. Independently of that, it is good for boys to learn to ride. I used to be fond of it, but I am too stout now. Thank goodness I can still swim. I did enjoy the swims with those boys in the summer. Plucky little beggars they are." "They will be in the seventh heaven!" exclaimed Mrs. Henderson. "They have always wished so much to ride." Uncle Robert beamed. "I do hope those boys will grow up to be a comfort to you," said Mrs. Henderson fervently. "You have done so much for us all, and there is nothing we can give you in return." "What should I have done without you?" cried Uncle Robert. "There Annie goes off and marries her colonel. Philip forsakes the nest. Hawk's nest, I should have been left stranded with no one to look after me but you. And you keep the home for me as comfortable as Annie did, which is saying a good deal, for there are few women so capable as Annie." "But that is so little," said Mrs. Henderson. "Then there is something greater you can do, if you will," he told her. "What is it?" she asked eagerly. "Be my wife." End of chapter 47. Read by Nancy Cochran Gorgen, Gilbert, Arizona, February 18, 2023. End of The 13th Man by Mrs. Coulson Kernahan.